Hello everyone and welcome back once again to the NPC Dungeon. Today we're skipping right to the end and talking all about the Epilogue, more specifically how to use Epilogue to end off a D&D campaign. I'm going to talk about what Epilogue means in the context of D&D, give you some tips for how to and how not to go about it, and I'll even share some of the reasons why I use this method to finish off my own campaigns. So, as always, let's learn something. First, a little disclaimer. This is not an episode about how to end a campaign. I'll be giving a few pointers on that here, but the main focus is on Epilogue. So to start the obvious, what is an epilogue? Well, I like to think of it as an element of a story that occurs after the actual events of the main story and is generally told after the bulk of the rest of the story. It usually follows what became the characters and any other important elements of the story afterward. I said story a lot in that, didn't I? Anyway, now what does this mean for D&D? Well, it's largely the same. One major difference is that it may not be as far-reaching or as strict as what you might expect from, say, a movie or a novel. I generally try to avoid saying things like, well, this character went on to become this or that, and this ended up being this way, so I'm not quite as far-reaching. I may also try to avoid making it into some kind of strict setup, like some sort of specific scene or encounter, so I'm not quite as strict either, but more on that in a moment. It also generally won't be a full session. It will most likely end up being just part of the session. You'll probably have your final boss battle, and then after that, move on to some epilogue. At least that's how I typically do it. Remember, this isn't an encounter. Epilogue is more like roleplay and narration. Again, at least that's how I typically do it. One other thing this means for D&D is that you'll be doing a lot of narrating. I mean, you do a lot of narrating as a DM anyway, but this isn't combat, and this isn't the final boss. This isn't even the reward for completing the quest. This is after all of that, however briefly after that it may be. And this is pure storytelling and closing up. But even though this is storytelling and narration, that doesn't mean that this is all you, and that your players are taking a back seat to the glorious conclusion of the story you're telling. And that's actually my first tip. Don't forget to let your players have agency even here, especially here at the end. I know I'm always saying that your players should have as much agency in the story as humanly possible, and then some, but that doesn't stop being true just because you're at the final session. In fact, it's even more true here, I think. I have said before, in my second episode on immersion, I do believe, if you're curious, that it's much easier to become engaged in a campaign if you feel like you're the one pushing the story along. There's something just really satisfying about being able to guide the story, and every good story should come to a satisfying ending. How can the ending be satisfactory if the players don't feel like they've brought it into existence? If you force the ending of the story, it can end up feeling cheap or even boring. For example, let's say that you decide after the events of the campaign one of your characters goes on to become a doctor, but nothing in their arc led up to that. You can see how that would immediately become unsatisfying and probably a little bit rude as well. It's important to be paying attention to your players so that you know how they'll most likely want their characters to end off and how best to do that. I mentioned a number of other reasons why you might want to be paying attention to your characters and your players rather in my first episode on combat if you want to check that one out. But anyway, maybe you have one player who's been playing an old warrior and really wants a warrior's death or to die in some epic battle. Maybe you have somebody else who might want to flee off alone and become some kind of hermit after the events of the campaign. Another may want to go into science or medicine, and the list goes on. One thing you can do is ask that before the final session. Ask them what kind of things they think their characters might do after the events of the campaign and go from there. And this may change, and that's fine, so try to stay updated on it and try to keep paying attention to them. Often, actually, your players might end up making decisions in that final session that you didn't expect, like incapacitating the final boss during round 1, or accidentally letting the main evil of the campaign that has been centered around out into the world. And this kind of makes sense, right? During the final session, the stakes are going to be a lot higher, so you should be ready for your players to try to do creative things to get what they want out of the final bit of the story. But, as I often say, you might already know what I'm about to say here, I think this is a good thing. I often find that these random sidelines lead even better into what I had planned for the players myself. Use this. Use their wacky ideas to lead them into the finale. What better way than to allow their actions to lend them some agency in the very end and bring on a satisfying ending? As I often say, I know I at least said this in an episode on planning for encounters, we do this together, and chances are what your group does together will end up being much better and providing a better experience than what you might plan on your own. But as you might have guessed, this requires a lot of planning and a lot of improv, so that's what we'll be talking about next. Let's stop and think for a second. If what I said earlier is true, and more agency will lead to higher player satisfaction, and you want the ending to be the most satisfying part of the campaign, it stands to reason that you're going to want to have your players making a lot more decisions and having a lot more agency during the end, or at least giving them a lot of opportunities to roleplay. And this means that you will inevitably have to flex your improv muscles. And this is because with all this agency, your players are going to throw you some curveballs, and so you need to be ready to think on your feet. But this doesn't mean that you don't plan. In fact, as I also have been known to say, I find myself quoting myself a lot this episode, I think that the most important part of improv, at least for D&D, is planning. I might actually make a whole episode on D&D improv in the future. Let's say that you and your players to come face to face with the final boss, win out at the end, and then end the campaign off at a ball that they were recently invited to. Ask yourself, who might the players try to talk to at this event? What is the point of this event? Why does it mark the end of the campaign? Is it a celebration of a peace treaty of some kind the players helped bring about? Is it to celebrate the end of the reign of a horrible monster the players just helped to defeat? And then, what will the players do there? Will they get rewarded? How will they react? And how do you intend to react to that? Honestly, parties in general are hard because it's so roleplay heavy, and there's always something going on. There are a ton of NPCs to keep track of, and so many options for your players. So let's look at another example as well. What if, after the final boss, your players have to decide what to do with the artifact they traveled so far to find and wrench from the hands of the villain who ended up collecting it? Well, one might want to destroy it. One might want to hide it. Another may want to contact a holy order of paladins they're a part of and try to dispose of it that way. And even then, how? How will they want to hide it? Where will they want to hide it? Do they have an NPC from their backstory who can help? Is there a place earlier in the campaign they learned about? And the same goes for the other alternatives. Be ready for them to debate and have all these alternatives ready. And let's be honest, they probably won't pick any one of them. But all the ideas that you have in mind in preparation will give you a kind of scaffold to build off of. This is true for improv in general, I think, and it's definitely true here. Let's continue that last example and say that you then intend for your players to go their separate ways afterward. What if it doesn't end up that way? What if your players let the villain go free? This sounds kind of hard to deal with, but it doesn't have to be. It could very easily lead into a kind of cinematic final save the world style epilogue where you use broad sweeping descriptions and just a few important dice rolls to give your players one final chance to come back as an underdog and take one last shot at the bad guy who so wronged them in the past. Or maybe it's become so much more than a simple feud and that villain has basically won and the world is no longer the same. Describe the desolate wasteland it has become and allow your players to bring nations and allies together and defeat this evildoer once and for all, and then afterwards let them do what they will, whether they stay together and help and rebuild or hermit or die in battle or whatever. See what I mean about this kind of cooperation being better often than your own planning? And this also plays into one of the tricks that I like to use to allow this epilogue to help me actually end the campaign. This method utilizes a lot of broad sweeping descriptions and it requires you to zoom in on different players as how they intend to resolve their arcs come into focus. What I do is while I'm narrating or talking to one player, I'm thinking about the next scene or the next player I'm going to talk to and I'm planning and mapping that out in my head ahead of time. This method gives you time to plan, and if you're anything like me, this extra time will make the final session so much easier. But I still have one more point that I want to get at before closing out, and that is just have fun. This won't be a very long point, but it'll probably be my most important, and that's why I saved it for last. I say this because ending a campaign can be very daunting, and it isn't hard to see why. You've been running this game for months probably, and that stretch of time has probably built up a lot of anticipation and a lot of expectation for the final session, and the pressure is really on you to make sure that you deliver. But these last sessions are also, at least in my opinion, some of the most fun because they really get to the heart of what this game is. We often have to completely abandon our plans during the session, and even more than usual, and it really becomes almost this stream of consciousness conclusion that you and your friends are forging together, almost like a conversation, and to me that's just beautiful. And I find that my best sessions are usually sessions where I can just let go and have fun. I have fun, my players have fun, and at the end of the day, that's really what we all want here. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you found it useful. As always, thanks for watching. If you want, feel free to check out this week's story, where I'll continue last week's series, all about how the party met in the beginning of this campaign that I'm telling, and come back next week where I'll continue my weird beginning and end of campaign advice and talk a little bit about how to begin a campaign, and where I'll take a break from my current campaign story series and talk about how I began the other campaign that I've been telling stories from recently. So be ready to see our old friends V57, Empyrean, and others. Thanks for watching, and until next time, let's learn something.